Welcome to Flexibility Focus, the podcast where we dive deep into the science of flexibility training. If you're a previous listener and you're returning to the show, welcome back. And if this is your first episode, allow me to wish you a warm welcome. But whether you've been here before or this is your first time, thank you for tuning in. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, which is actually the first episode of 2022. I'm recording this on New Year's Eve, so I apologize if you hear any fireworks going off in the background, but wherever you're listening from, I'd like to wish you a very prosperous new year for the 12 months lying ahead of us. If you don't know who I am, my name is Dan Van Zandt. I'm your host. I've been researching and teaching the science of flexibility professionally since 1998, though I've been studying the subject for over 30 years now. I've been a peer reviewer for several scientific publications, and I've lectured at a number of universities throughout Europe. The title of this episode is What is Mobility Actually? And I'm going to explain what the word mobility means in the context of how it is used in the scientific literature. Now, this is an issue that requires clarification because there are many people in the health and fitness sphere, some of them with enormous audiences, who misapply the terms flexibility and mobility. And while a misunderstanding of the meaning of flexibility is partly to blame, a lack of awareness of what the term mobility means plays a much more substantial role in the misuse of these terms. So if you've heard the phrase mobility is active range of motion and flexibility is passive range of motion, then whomever told you that was using inaccurate language. And if you're using that phrase and you're telling other people that mobility is active range of motion and flexibility is passive range of motion, then you are using inaccurate language. And I say these things not to insult you, but simply to point out that there is a considerable disconnect between what you're saying and what researchers in the scientific community are saying. Now understand that I'm not telling you what to say. I respect the right to free speech, and if you want to keep using mobility and flexibility in that way, then that is your prerogative. And all I'm doing is pointing out the inaccuracies in your language and the fact that you're being inconsistent if you use those terms in that particular manner, but then profess to be science-based because you're going against the conventions of science. Now, I covered the meaning of the term flexibility and the different types of flexibility in episode 1 of the show way back in 2020, but I'll provide a basic revision of the material here. So flexibility is the ability to adapt to meet changing circumstances. When we talk about cognitive flexibility, we're referring to the ability to change your mind or your opinion about something. When we talk about emotional flexibility, we're referring to a person's capacity to regulate their emotional state. When we talk about physical flexibility, we're talking about a person's ability to change the position of their body. Now, the key to understanding flexibility is in the metric which is used to quantify it or to measure it numerically. And in the case of physical flexibility, that is range of motion. So if you go into the scientific literature, you'll see that in more than 95% of research papers, flexibility is defined as the range of motion available at a joint or a series of joints. And the word motion is key here because it's a phrase that originated in classical mechanics several centuries ago. And classical mechanics is a branch of physics, and motion means to change position. The thing which has changed position in the context of physical flexibility is human joints. And the word range means a difference between two values, and so range of motion is the amount a joint change position between point A and point B. And flexibility has been measured by a range of motion for well over 120 years because the words flexibility and motion both refer to a capacity for change. In simple terms, flexibility is your ability to change the position of your joints, i.e. it is your potential to move. And because joints can change position under different types of circumstances, it follows that there are different types of flexibility, the names of which refer to each of the possible circumstances. The types of circumstances can be boiled down to two scenarios. Number one, the the joint is either moving or not moving at the time of measurement. And number 2, the muscles crossing the joint are either contracting or relaxing. When the joint is moving at the time of measurement, the type of flexibility is called dynamic flexibility, because dynamic refers to a state of acceleration. Acceleration means to change speed. When you think about all types of joint movements, they are a process of constantly changing speed, i.e. speeding up and slowing down, speeding up and slowing down. When the joint is stationary at the time of measurement, the type of flexibility is called static flexibility, because static refers to a state in which acceleration is absent, so there is no change in speed. And since joint movements cannot continue at a constant velocity indefinitely, owing to structural and physiological constraints that place an absolute limit on motion, we call stationary displays of range of motion static flexibility. And these terms, static and dynamic, both also come from classical mechanics and have been used to describe human motion for a very long time. With regards to the second scenario, in which the muscles crossing the joint are either contracting or relaxing, the words we use here follow the conventions of the biological sciences. If the muscles are contracting and are therefore using chemical energy to power the generation of active tension, we use the term active flexibility to describe such displays of range of motion. If the muscles are not contracting and therefore there's only the presence of passive tension, we use the term passive flexibility to describe that type of motion. So clearly this presents us with 4 types of flexibility: dynamic, static, active and passive, which should already be setting off alarm bells in your head if you use the mobility is active, flexibility is passive model of training, because you're missing half the picture. All that the words active and passive tell us is whether the muscles are contracting or relaxing. That's it. There is no description about the nature of movement at the joints, i.e. dynamic versus static. And that's hugely important, because the body responds in very specific ways depending upon whether joints are moving or not moving. And these 2 scenarios, the joint is moving or not moving and the muscles are contracting or not contracting, never occur independently from each other, meaning that the joint is always either moving or not moving, and the muscles are always either contracting or not contracting. So this gives us 4 very specific types of flexibility: dynamic active, dynamic passive, static active, and static passive. And if you always keep those questions in your mind when analyzing human movement, number 1, is the joint moving or not moving? And number 2, are the muscles contracting or not contracting? You should always be able to determine the type of flexibility which is on display quite easily. And this is an important ability to develop, because each type of flexibility is best developed by the type of stretching that is named after it, i.e. dynamic active flexibility is best developed by dynamic active stretching. Static passive flexibility is best developed by static passive stretching, etc. So knowing the types of flexibility that are on display or which are required by a given movement or sport allows you to make much better informed training decisions when it comes to deciding what you need to do to develop them. So what about mobility? Well, if we look to the scientific literature and to the health and fitness space online, like forums, blogs, social media, and so forth, we see there are generally 5 types of mobility that people are talking about. They are: number 1, a synonym for dynamic active flexibility; number 2, a synonym for flexibility in general; number 3, the ability to maintain a mobile base of support; number 4, degrees of freedom; number 5, arthrokinematics, or the intrinsic motions between the joint surfaces. So the first definition, a synonym for dynamic active flexibility, is definitely the most common definition that gets used on social media, because The people who use this definition are applying it to actions of the body in which the joints are moving under a person's own voluntary control. And using mobility in this context is a poor linguistic choice, because the precise definition on social media is very haphazard and inconsistent, because one person might use it to refer to just dynamic range of motion. Someone else might use it to describe dynamic range of motion combined with neurological control, or the amount of dexterity a person has over that joint. And someone else might use it to describe dynamic range of motion combined with neurological control and combined with strength, or how much force the muscles can produce in that range of motion. However, it's interesting to note that most people who use those definitions of mobility, i.e. they say mobility is flexibility plus control, or they say it's flexibility plus control plus strength, almost always measure it using range of motion only, and they don't offer any information about how they quantify the control and strength aspects of their so-called mobility, which should make you question their ability to teach this thing they call mobility, because if 2/3 of this quality or attribute they call mobility are not actually being measured, then how can a person possibly expect to make progress? Therefore, my advice to you, if you use these definitions of mobility, is to spend time giving serious consideration to how you define that word, and also the metrics by which you quantify it, or the things you measure it by. The second definition from our list, mobility as a synonym for flexibility in general, appears in a small number of research papers that don't use the word flexibility at all, and instead the authors use the terms active mobility and passive mobility to describe active and passive ranges of motion respectively. This convention likely stems from the use of the term mobility to describe degrees of freedom, which is item number 4 on our list, and I'll get to that in due course. The third definition on our list, the ability to maintain a mobile base of support, is without a doubt the most common way that the term mobility is used in the scientific literature, and it can be considered the ability to move the whole body through space from one point to another point safely, efficiently, and without assistance. So put simply, mobility is your ability to do things like get up out of a chair, walk to the kitchen, walk up and down the stairs in your home, and so on. And this is why tools like wheelchairs and walking canes are called mobility aids, because they aid or they assist you in your ability to navigate through space with a decreased risk of injury and by expending less energy. And just as a side note, this is a point I've talked about before in previous episodes of the podcast, in my posts on social media, and I've talked about it at innumerable seminars and lectures for many years, but I'm noticing recently there are more and more people claiming to have come up with this observation first about how things like wheelchairs and walking canes are called mobility aids, which I find rather humorous, but the important point is that the message gets across. The fourth item on our list, degrees of freedom, refers to the number of directions in which a joint can move. So, taking the glenohumeral joint in the shoulder as an example, which is a ball and socket joint formed by the association of the ball-like humeral head with the socket-like glenoid fossa, this joint can move in 3 primary ways. The first is flexion-extension, the second is abduction-adduction, and medial lateral rotation is the third way. So therefore, in the field of biomechanics, the glenohumeral joint is said to have 3 degrees of freedom, because there are 3 directions in which it can move, and every possible movement occurs along some combination of these degrees of freedom. The term mobility has been used in biomechanics to refer to degrees of freedom for well over 100 years, and the sum of degrees of freedom, or the total number of directions in which all of the joints of the body can move, is called the mobility of the system, which is calculated by the Chebyshev-Grubler-Kutzbach criterion, which is also known as the mobility formula. An important point to remember about degrees of freedom is that they cannot be increased with training. And something that I see on social media with alarming frequency is the number of people who claim that their training method improves or increases degrees of freedom. You cannot increase degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom are the number of directions a joint can move in, not how far a joint can move in any of those directions. How far a joint can move in any particular direction is its range of motion, which, of course, is a measure of flexibility. This is probably where using the word mobility to refer to range of motion originally arose, because range of motion is measured in degrees of an arc, and more range of motion means greater freedom of movement, and so it's relatively straightforward to see how people might conflate definitions of these terms. The fifth and final item on our list, arthrokinematics, refers to the joint surface relationship. So this is how one articular surface within the joint space moves relative to the other articular surface, or in other words, it's how the end of one bone moves on or around the other bone. The term joint mobility was originally coined to describe these movements, which are also called relative motions or accessory motions. They're called relative motions because one bony surface moves relative to the other bony surface within the joint. They're also called accessory motions because they're caused by the voluntary motions that you control. For example, let's say you want to flex or bend your knee. For that movement to occur, you first have to contract your hamstrings. Those hamstrings pull on their attachments and they move the tibia. And the accessory motions that occur between the proximal end of the tibia and the distal end of the femur facilitate that movement. But the accessory motions that occur inside the knee can only happen as a result of the voluntary motions you can control, which are also called physiological motions and real motions, because they're essentially the real motions or real movements that we see as the bony segments extending out and away from the joint move in an arc through space. These arthrokinematic or accessory motions within the joint space are completely passive and we have no control over them. And because arthrokinematic motions have been referred to for a long time as joint mobility, the techniques intended to improve their quality are called mobilizations, which are different from a lot of the so-called mobilizations you see on social media, because those that you see on social media are really just dynamic stretches designed to improve dynamic active flexibility. Real mobilizations utilize the input of an external force into the joint space, and examples of this include using a therapy band to apply a traction force to the joint, or a therapist using their hands to push on the bones, like when a chiropractor performs manual adjustments on a patient's spine, which causes that loud cracking noise. It's a process called cavitation. So throughout most of the history of the scientific literature, mobility is actually quite an ambiguous term with several definitions that vary depending upon the context of the journal in which a study is published. For example, biomechanics journals tend to use slightly different terminology to motor control journals, but rarely is the word mobility used to refer to range of motion. The term that is almost always used is flexibility, and flexibility is not, and never really has been, described as just the passive lengthening of tissues. That's something called extensibility, or passive range of motion, which is unfortunately now a prominent misconception on social media that arose based upon the misunderstandings of a few coaches and educators who haven't truly grasped the concept of what flexibility is, and they have since gone on to promote their limited and inaccurate understanding to their large followings. Even the strict definition of mobility that we find in most English language dictionaries isn't particularly helpful. This dictionary definition states that mobility is the state or quality of being mobile, and mobile is the ability to move freely and easily. And this raises two issues when we try to apply that definition to range of motion. The first is that freely and easily implies a lack of resistance to movement rather than a change in position or how much change in position has occurred, which, if you think back to earlier in the episode, flexibility and range of motion are far more appropriate to be used together in this context. A lack of resistance to movement means that perhaps quantifying the amount of friction between the bony surfaces within a joint is a more suitable metric by which to quantify mobility. For example, in biotribology, which is the science of friction, lubrication, and wear in biological systems, researchers can use a device called a tribometer to measure the coefficient of friction between articular surfaces, but that is a rather complicated and cumbersome procedure, and articular cartilage also tends to have very low coefficients of friction to the extent that it's questionable whether quantifying friction would furnish much usable data to the coach or therapist. The second issue we encounter when trying to apply the dictionary definition of mobility to range of motion is that it implies the act of moving or being in motion at the time of measurement, which means that in reality we should really only be applying mobility to ranges of motion that we display during periods of acceleration, i.e. during dynamic active joint movements. And indeed, people are doing that when they use mobility as a synonym for dynamic active flexibility, but they are then faced with the problem of what to call techniques that utilize static positions like isometric stretches. And these are exercises where you get into a static position and you hold that position as you contract the muscles on either side of the joint. You can't call these things mobility training because you're not moving, and the definition of mobility implies that you have to be moving to develop it. The question that I suppose needs to be asked here is, does any of this matter? Because inevitably, whenever discussions about terminology arise, someone will always say you're just arguing about semantics being the meanings of words. And I find it ironic that the people who make this statement fail to possess the foresight necessary to realize that when they first say mobility is active range of motion and flexibility is passive range of motion, they're actually building a semantics-based argument. So it's only logical that counter-arguments will address the meanings of the words and terms that they chose to use. The answer to the question, does any of this really matter, is a resounding yes. And this is for a number of reasons. Number one, there is a colossal divide between the language used in the scientific literature and the language used in the health and fitness industry. Now, I'm not advocating that every trainer and therapist should use obscure verbiage when talking to their clients, but using the correct definitions of scientific terms like flexibility and mobility in conversations with the general public will help to close the gap of misunderstanding between research and industry, and perhaps stem the flow of pervasive misinformation that has, unfortunately, infected the health and fitness space. Reason number two is that if we're all using the same vocabulary, then we'll all be wasting less time trying to correct misinformation whenever someone posts yet another foolish mobility is active, flexibility is passive post on social media. And I want to make it abundantly clear here that I don't blame the people who create these posts for the misinformation. I blame the people who taught them these dumb statements. And reason number three is what we call things influences the things we do. So if you're using a limited model of training, like the mobility is active range of motion and flexibility is passive range of motion model, then you're not accounting for important variables like velocity, which can only be accounted for if we know how to consider them and talk about them accurately. So the model of flexibility that I described earlier in the episode, in which there are 4 types: dynamic active, dynamic passive, static active, and static passive is very easy to understand, and it allows us to account for things like velocity, because we're able to talk about how fast the joints are moving during dynamic active ranges of motion. And so we can also account for how the body will respond to things like velocity. And this is of immense importance because flexibility is speed specific. And it should come as no surprise that the overwhelming majority of so-called mobility exercises that you see on social media are performed at excruciatingly slow speeds because the people coaching them don't understand how to train flexibility properly, which is a direct result of using a limited pedagogical model as the foundation of their approach to training. Interestingly, a number of training providers that popularize the mobility as active and flexibility as passive model have, in recent months, retroactively tried to incorporate the subject of velocity into their pedagogical or teaching models, which is a good thing. And I'm not trying to take credit for being the catalyst for this change in their policy, but it is satisfying to see people starting to realize the folly of using such a limited model, mostly for the sake of marketing and to create this air of superiority of one method over another. So, to summarize, mobility is not a particularly useful term because its definition varies so much in the scientific literature and in the health and fitness industry, whereas the definitions of flexibility have been more or less consistent and ubiquitous throughout the scientific literature. In research, the most common usage of mobility refers to the ability to maintain a mobile base of support or to walk, and it's not really used all that much to refer to range of motion. And in the few instances when it is used to refer to range of motion, it describes both active and passive range of motion. In the health and fitness industry, mobility is usually described as some combination of dynamic flexibility, motor control, and strength, but again, control and strength are not really accounted for, and so people are saying it's a combination of flexibility and control and strength, but they're only measuring range of motion, which makes that definition rather pointless. And again, I want to stress here that you are free to use whatever words you want to use in whatever ways you want to use them. I'm just here to tell you what the science says, and it's up to you whether or not you decide to implement that. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the show. If you did, please show your support by leaving a review on whichever platform you get your podcasts from. Like and subscribe if you're listening to this on YouTube. And please share the show with your family, friends, colleagues, pets, and anyone else you think might benefit from listening to it. I greatly appreciate your support, and all support is exceedingly helpful for me to accomplish my mission, which is to educate the world on the science of flexibility training. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions or comments. You can send an email to dan@flexibilityresearch.com. You can find me on Instagram at @flexibility.research. There's also a Facebook group, and let me know your thoughts in the comments section on YouTube. Lastly, if you've always wanted to coach flexibility training according to what the science actually says, then the latest intake of the Master Flexibility Trainer course is currently open for registration. Class starts on January 30th, and the next one will be in a couple of months after that. So if you want to know more, please go to www.flexibilityresearch.com and hit the Work With Me tab at the top of your screen. That's it for this episode. I hope you have a fantastic start to 2022. Until next time, stay flexible.